also differences in the sets of symbols that people use, but in this webinar I'm using the one that typically is found in course books in Australia and most often used in students' dictionaries, so in this Australian context, using that chart. So we're not focused today on how to formally transcribe individuals' articulation, but this chart can be used to represent sounds, whether you're saying bus or bus, if you're saying lobster or lobster, as my Bostonian family friends say. So just keep that thought in mind if you're wondering why I'm using this particular chart that's often called the British English chart. There are lots of variations in how people transcribe these, but the symbols that are used in the British English one, if you regard them not as very fixed pronunciation symbols, but as representing those sounds. So for example, here, this is the one where I've written in words in pairs as far as I could. For example, you can see at the top there, seat and sit, to show the sounds that are represented by those symbols above. So we'll be looking at how we use our lips and tongue, teeth and jaw, how we use our air and breath and the voice box to understand better how to help students with their pronunciation and how that is reflected in the organisation of the chart. In these, you'll see there's quite a number of strategies to help the students, for example, those ones down the bottom left-hand corner there, as a way of helping students focus on the shape of their mouth and what they're doing with their mouth to help them then try to create the sound, reinforcing how the sounds are made so they can really feel it and develop that muscle memory. It can help also in helping them see the difference in the sounds, even if they can't hear them, they can't perceive them sometimes. There may be some strategies we suggest here that are like memorable hooks to help them remember what those sounds are. And this fits in very much with various people's comments, Thornbury and Underhill and Sweeting and so on, about how to do more than just model and drill. So it's not a matter of modelling and then they immediately repeat it and that's it. There are other strategies to really help them to understand more about this as a physical exercise. By the way, in the top right-hand corner, I'm not going to be dealing with those symbols there, the primary and secondary stress and the arrows used to indicate intonation. So let's move on and just have an overview of the chart and the vowel sounds versus the consonant sounds. So you can see the top, the vowels, the bottom, the consonants. And once you understand the chart and how it's organised, I've always found it really useful just as an anchor, a reminder to help me when I'm planning or in the learning space. If we look at what's differentiating the vowels and the consonants, with the vowels, there is no obstruction to the air escaping through the mouth, whereas with the consonants, there is some kind of obstruction, for example, through the use of your lips or your teeth. The vowel sounds are all voiced. So voicing, if you gently place your fingers on your voice box, don't strangle yourselves, and just try saying that seat sound. When you say E, you can feel that vibration there. Whereas with the consonants, they're in unvoiced and voiced pairs, particularly in the first two rows. So for example, again with your fingers gently on your throat, if you say P versus B, you can feel the unvoiced P and then the voiced B. Another difference with the vowel sounds, there are those single and double sounds. We'll see those in a bit more detail later, but in this chart I find it useful. The double sounds are indicated by those double dots, so you can see those five. Oh no, sorry, what am I saying? The single and double sounds in the left-hand side, the first four rows, the single sounds, the monophthongs, the right-hand side, those three columns in the double sounds. And then within the first four columns, those long and short sounds with the double dots indicating the longer sounds, like seat, for example. With the vowels, then, it's all about the tongue and the lips. The jaw is, I'm putting that in there because you'll see later why I think it's easier to help the students focus on what's happening with their jaw rather than their tongue. So it's all about the shaping and voicing, whereas with the consonants, the tongue, the lips, the teeth and the jaw, it's all about shaping and unvoicing or voicing and the force. So as we go through the chart, you might want to have your own copy of the chart to scribble notes on, but also develop your own imagery to help you remember. Practice using it when you're planning, telling someone else about it. All of these things I found helped me develop confidence and accuracy with it. So let's move on and look at one aspect of vowel sounds, the single sound vowel sounds, and that's to do with the tongue. You can see on the left those rather startling images of what's happening with your tongue there. So it's all about the tongue height here, how high the tongue is or how low it is. So helping students to notice this, asking questions, for example, where is your tongue? Can you feel it? Visualizing saying the sound E, then saying it and holding it and noticing where their tongue is on the roof of the mouth. And then repeating for egg, the E sound, and then the A for cap. Feeling the difference in what's happening with your tongue. Some people find it useful to look using pictures or a mirror, looking at your partner, or even holding something between your teeth, a pen or a paddle pop stick or your finger, not clenching it between your teeth, but just placing it between your teeth so that when you say E, then you can feel the difference in where your tongue is. You then switch down to say A, and you can notice the difference. Perhaps using gestures, holding your hand up like you might be making the shadow puppet of a head of a bird with your thumb and your fingertips touching, and then opening them up to indicate to the students there's a change there in their jaw. Maybe matching activities, using visuals, matching with known words, spotting the odd one out, matching with the phonetic symbols if you really think or they think they need to learn them. But what I think is most useful to focus is to think about that arrow with the tongue. Put your thumb on your chin and your forefinger on your nose, and looking at the chart, if we go across the rows, you'll notice they're quite similar. So when you hold your thumb on your chin, your forefinger on your nose, and go across, let's try it. If you say E, I, U, U, your jaw's not moving much. Whereas when you go down that first column, let's try it. If you say, think to yourself, E, just let that resonate with yourself, and then E, and then down the bottom left-hand corner to the A. You can really feel the jaw movement, which is reflecting the movement in the tongue. So I found that one's the most useful to help students. So if you look at a very common sound there, can you see the one for mother? Not mother, but mother, the schwa. Instantly looking at the chart here, seeing that it's in the second row there, you know that your jaw is moving down a little bit to make that sound, but it's not moving down as much as for the sound below it, the up, as in cup. So that's one thing to keep in mind, just getting them to put their thumb on the chin, the forefinger on the nose. Another aspect of the tongue, it's not so obvious, I think, this one. Not so immediately useful, but it does reinforce the position. Again, thinking, using questions, asking yourself about what's happening, those other techniques as before, to notice whether your tongue is relatively forward towards the front or in the middle or the back. Perhaps as you make these sounds, if you draw in a breath of cold air in particular, you can feel that on your tongue. So let's use the middle row here. When you say eh, just hold your mouth in position and then breathe in quickly, and you can feel the air over your tongue. When you say eh in the first column compared to the last, the or, and just breathing in, you would be able to notice that your tongue has moved back. That one I find is not so useful for students. They can't feel that so easily. However, it's useful to think about. So let's move on and think about the lips. Now this is useful, helping students to notice the shape of their lips. As you can see there, those pictures indicating that your lips in the first column, front of the mouth, relatively spread, moving towards the last column where they're more rounded or pursed. So again, using those same techniques, the questions, the matching activities, gestures, for example, putting your forefingers at the corners of your mouth and pulling your fingers away towards your ears to show them the sounds in the first column where their lips are quite spread. So all of those ones in the first column, quite spread towards the back, becoming rounded and pursed slightly forward. Tricks, perhaps helping them think about it by getting them to hold their lips in position for certain sounds, as for E compared to oo, smiling for E, whistling, blowing on a hot drink perhaps for the oo, or saying ah. Some people find it helpful to put a forefinger vertically against their lips, but I think this last strategy on this slide, where they've got their thumb and forefinger on either side of their mouth, keep that in mind. As you go across the rows, you can see how different they are. So let's try the bottom row. When you say oh, you can feel that movement in the lips, particularly the difference between the first column and the last one. So, for example, if students are having a problem with sounds like the schwa, again, let's go back to that one, recapping, it's in the second column, so the lips are not as spread as in the first, it's on the second row, so the jaw's dropping a little bit, but not that much. So this is where you can look at it and go, ah, that's what I need to help the students to focus on. And the last aspect here with these single sound vowel sounds is another useful one about the length. Again, gestures to help them notice those long ones versus the short ones. So again, the double dots here being very helpful with hand gestures, drawing hands apart, using elastic bands, stretching them, movement, rising on your toes. For example, the I, just as you say that, you're usually standing up in the learning space, but just rising up on your toes, or mimicking a gibbon, perhaps if you can visualize. I'm putting my hands, see the pull sound? I'm putting my hands above my head, raising my arms up, holding up my hands to reflect that shape and thinking of that ooh, ooh, ooh kind of sound. You're prepared to do anything as a teacher to help get things across, so I'm quite prepared to do that. Lots of possibilities showing emotions or attitudes through interjections, for example, ooh and ah, or expressions like Can you see that work sound? The that's a tricky one for students, the difference between the work and the walk. Images, for example, you can see the cup sound, see the it looks a little bit like an arrow pointing up or an open umbrella. So let's just stop and have a look here at that heart sound, thinking about that one. It's a long sound, and what can we tell? It's on the bottom row, so the jaw's really dropped. It's in the third column, so the lips are not closed, pursed completely. Just look at yourself, think about how you're saying ah. So this is the sound the dentist asks you to make because they've got the time and the space to get in there and do their work. So using that context may be helpful, linking to known words containing that sound, perhaps the ones on the chart or ones they make up themselves, doing some work with minimal pairs to help with reception, their perception of the sound as well as production. You know, the work, walk, fur, for, mixing it up, shirt, short, etc. Okay, so just a point to clarify about the vowel sounds. The images there I think are very useful to help us remember the front of the mouth towards the back, reflecting the position on the chart, the sounds that are high in the mouth, low in the mouth, the tongue position, but also noticing that that issue about the way the lips are spread, it's not fixed. All of those ones in the first column are not precisely the same, but roughly. So let's move on and have a look at those diphthongs, those double sound vowel sounds, particularly noticing how your mouth is shaped, how it changes, and also the jaw movement. The jaw often goes down and up, not just down as in for ah, but down and up. So for example, that one in the top left-hand corner, you can see it's made of two elements. You've got the it and the So one strategy to help students understand this is holding your hands far apart and raising one when you say it, and then is that schwa sound, and then moving your hands a bit closer together to say it, and then bringing them really close together. So we've gone from it, ear, really close together, ear. You'll notice these ones are organised in columns according to what's the common second element. There's a lot of information, a lot of technical terms about these diphthongs, whether they're centering or closing or rising or opening, whatever, but I think it's most useful if you really just get them to use their thumb on their chin and forefinger on their nose to feel the jaw movement, or even just to use your hand gestures to show the down-up, how strong that down-up movement is in the diphthongs. So a summary of strategies now with those vowel sounds. Generally thinking about questions to help them notice things, help them to think about what they're doing, feeling the difference between, for example, e and a with the jaw movement. So if students having a problem with red, saying rad, getting them to notice the difference in their jaw. Questions with and or, like work and walk, asking them about their lips, or questions about the length, for example, whether they live in the city or they leave in the city. Also using some kind of visuals in some way, things that they can see or read. Words, for example, hat, hut, heart, hot, all of those ones from the bottom row of the single sound vowel sounds. Looking again, using gestures. I'm not quite sure if people still remember Tarzan, but you know, the old ah, or the dentist. I think everyone will remember the dentist slightly better. Linking to known words with the same sound or with different sounds. You can see there's some examples. And you may have your own suggestions, and you know, people may be typing in the chat box about other ideas that they've got. We will be stopping soon to think about problems that students have. So if you do have any questions about problem sounds, if you do want to type them in the chat box and Sophie can relay them to me. But there's the vowel sounds part of the chart. If we remember the information about those sounds. So for example, if a student's got a problem with, say, spot and sport, if you look for spot, you can see that hot sound versus sport, the walk sound immediately above it. Often students will have problems with neighbouring sounds that are in the same environment. So the difference between spot, I like spot, I play soccer. You can see the O on the bottom row. They need to make the or sound above it, so not dropping the jaw so much and making the sound longer. So any questions so far, Soph?
No.
Cool. Okay. By the way, those problem sounds later in the slides for you to use at the end, you'll be able to see there's some examples of problems for you to think about and some suggested answers just for people who need practice. So let's move on and look at the consonants. The consonants, you remember, are in 3 rows, and we'll be looking at them row by row. So the first row will be coming up very shortly. There it is. Okay, so looking at that first row there, the first thing to notice is they're in those unvoiced and voiced pairs. So put your fingers on your voice box and just feel that difference as you go across with p, b, t, d, ch, j, k, g. And again, from the front of the mouth to the back, like the vowel sounds, the single sounds organised in columns from the front of the mouth to the back, these ones as well. So p and b using your lips, and going to the end at the back of the mouth, you can feel that k and g in the back of your throat. So what's happening here, remembering with the consonants there is some kind of obstruction to the air. With these you're letting it go suddenly like a pop with most of them, the p, b, t, d, k, g, hence the name plosives, or letting it go a little bit more slowly with more friction, as you can see, for the ch and the j. So helping the students focus on the air, the breath, how they're holding it, how it's released. Not necessarily using terms like plosives and affricates with them, but just talking about the pop or talking about the air coming out a little bit more slowly, helping them to feel the voicing with their fingers on their throat, a hand over the mouth to feel the air, just thinking and feeling if that sound is made at the front of the mouth, in the middle of the back, being conscious of their lips, the tongue on the roof of the mouth, which part, where's your tongue, how's it helping it stop the sound. obstructing it first before it's released. So for example, the p and the b with your lips, when you get to t and d, you can feel your tongues moving back, touching the bump behind your teeth, and the others, ch, j, k, g, your tongue's moving back to the soft part of the roof of your mouth. So classic problems, for example, you know, park and bark, just helping them to notice the unvoicing, voicing there, for example. Now the next row of the consonant sounds has some similarities in that they are also organised in unvoiced and voiced pairs. Okay, we've just gone on. Let me go back. Okay, so let's try the f, and while you're feeling the voicing or the unvoicing voicing pairs, notice again from the front of the mouth to the back, but the way the air is passing through here, it's a bit like the air leaking out of a tyre. You're blocking it, but not completely. And the sounds are longer, though you can make them shorter. So for example, f, v, f. That one's a bit tricky, but think of theta. That think one's like theta versus this, where that's voiced, the s, z, the sh, and the zh. So with these ones, there's friction that's quite audible that helps them to notice how they're making the sound, but also thinking about their top teeth and their bottom lip with the f and the v. Now with some cultures, they seem a bit reluctant to put their top teeth on their bottom lip or to poke their tongue out between their teeth when you say f, putting your top teeth on your bottom lip, or f, the fan, van, think this sounds. Perhaps just getting them to drop their lip over their teeth to hide it a bit, but asking them questions about where their top teeth are, where their tongue is it further forward or further back? Where's the sound being made in your mouth? What shape are your lips? So for example, the snake sound, the s versus the sh. Now they're both unvoiced. You can feel s and sh, but if you get them to think about what shape their lips are making when they say s, and their lips are slightly spread versus when they say shh, that almost universal be quiet sound, they can see the difference in their lips being pushed further forward. Perhaps connecting them to sounds they know, like shh or the zh in vision. It sounds a bit like the container ship blast of a horn. So let's move on and look at the final row. And these are a little bit different. The other two, the first two rows of the consonants were organised into unvoiced voiced pairs. Here there's 4 sets. So look at the first 3. These ones are the nasals, and they're all voiced. You can feel the in those words, but they're nasals because of the air going through the nose. So the classic, when you've got a cold, it's impossible to say, "Mummy, make me a malted milkshake." If you want to hold your own nose and try saying that, get your students to, and it comes out as "Bubby, bake me a malted milkshake," because you can't produce the But again, front of the mouth to the back, the front to back. It's in that front column, like you remember the ones above, you had the p and the b, the f and the v. So the very closely connected, being at the front of the mouth. Now the next one, the h in hello, all by itself, because the shape your mouth makes is affected by the vowel sounds immediately following. If you think about when you say hi, hey, who, how, him, your mouth immediately gets into shape for that. And even though the h itself is not voiced, sometimes it's hard to separate it from the voicing in the vowel sound that follows. The next pair, the classic, the l and the both voiced. Here it's very helpful to use the sketches of the mouth. For example, you can see that figure 47E there. A simple sketch on the board, focusing them on where their tongue is touching or where it doesn't. So with the l touching the bump behind the teeth and pulling back and not touching, even though it's still quite high, with the So a sketch or hand gestures, if you hold up your hand flat and the other hand balled into a fist, pushing to touch l and pulling it away to show the is not touching. The last pair here, both voiced, the semi-vowels, the w, with that soft part of the mouth, making a kiss sound perhaps to remind students, that classic problem with, can I ask a question, just a quick kiss, or pointing to a list of words that have the what sound in them, or minimal pairs like kick and quick and keen and queen. And the last one, the y, not to be confused with the letter J. So again, remembering those terms up there, it's not very useful if, as a Uruguayan student said in response to an RU question, they responded in the affirmative with yes. To say you're misusing a palato-alveolar affricate instead of a palatal semivowel is not very helpful. So just getting them to think when they say j versus y, what's happening with your tongue, where it's touching, and it's not quite as forceful. So if you do have any questions about the consonant sounds, perhaps an opportunity to think about those if you wanted to write any in the chat box. Some general strategies for clarification and correction coming up. Thinking about using fingers for the voicing, fingers on the throat, asking them questions, you'll see these in a moment, about the length or the speed. Trust me. So if I've lost control of the slides, if you want to move, if you can just do...
I think you're back in control now. Have a go.
Okay, but in a moment you'll see these points about fingers on the throat for the voiced, unvoiced pairs.
Yeah.
Questions about the length. Okay, we have gone on too far. That's just caught up. Oh, there they are. Questions about the length, the speed of the air, perhaps using something like a tissue or your hand even just over your mouth. For example, the ch and the h. Questions about the teeth, tongue, jaw, etc. you can see with some examples. Visuals, those vampire teeth, thinking of the vampire with the two incisors in the top row coming down, or the shrugging figure with the upraised hands reflecting the w. Other kinds of visuals, any connection they can make, like the snake sound, looking, gestures, as I mentioned before, that kiss for the w. And again, linking to known sounds that have that sound or are different. Again, you may have other strategies that you want to share sometime. So if you have any questions, if any have come up, remembering, look at the chart, remind yourself what you know about the sounds, why they're in these rows, why they're in these pairs, what does that reflect about how we can make these sounds. And again, in a later slide, there's some examples of mistakes you can have a look at and some suggested strategies. Okay, so moving on, just summarising some of those strategies, really helping them notice, thinking about it, visualising before they produce it, giving them feedback or correction if it's really having an impact on pronunciation. Remembering some people have a problem perceiving the sounds and the differences, or problems producing, so some kind of visual reminder, and giving the opportunity to say it aloud or silently at different speeds. Exaggeration, as we know, helps students notice. Using other words, using highlighting. There's a lot of tasks out there. Lots of minimal pairs practice, matching, sorting, the odd one out, find someone whose name contains a certain sound, or stepping stones activities where they've got to move from one stepping stone to the other, and on each stone there's some particular problematic sound for them to help them. Even asking them what their sound means in their own first language. As for published activities, at the end there are a number of slides with references, and certainly making your own modifications to those. So familiarisation, is it you who needs to be familiar with it? Is it the students? Of course, I think all teachers do, and I think some students do and will. But it's obviously useful when you're planning to anticipate problems, be ready to deal with them. It comes into lessons in many ways. It may be the main aim. It may be just a warmer or a filler. It comes up in language and skills stages, as you know. But I definitely would recommend that you have access to the chart when you're planning, but also in class. So some strategies for correction, just listening and thinking yourself when they have a problem and getting them to listen and think, but also remembering, does it actually impede communication in any way? Is it possible for the student to change or not? Maybe it's not possible. Maybe there are ways around that. Using the chart, using those clues, using sounds in the same environment, perhaps having posters of problem words and sounds around, definitely using examples of errors they make. But thinking about your own expectations and theirs, not expecting immediate improvement. They do need lots of encouragement. You'll need to stop before they get frustrated or embarrassed. Even just saying, that's better, is going to help them. But it's really important also just finding out through surveys and questions what they want to do with pronunciation. Generally speaking, I think most of you would agree in any learning event, when you've worked on pronunciation at whatever level, students respond quite happily to that. They see that as something very useful. But doing a survey, asking questions particularly to find out what their individual goals are, can help you work with them. So a little bit of practice then for you. Just thinking about how you say those words. So take a moment, just look at those words. Now there's no context there, but I think you hopefully would have been able to work out most of them. The answers are at the end if you need them. Here you'll see a list of terms that are commonly used to talk about pronunciation. And I put this in here to help clarify, for example, when people talk about phonetics or phonemics, there is a difference in some use of terms by different people. And there's a summary there about the physicality of sounds production, just as a reminder to yourself of those issues. So if you have any questions about any of these, feel free to write them in the chat box. One thing I think that is a point I want to go back to is about the idea of modelling and drilling and whether or not that's effective. Many people have written about this, that repeating things, it's very behaviourist. It might be done quite automatically where they're copying, but as Thornberry says, not necessarily becoming more conscious of how the sounds are made. Underhill here talks about this, so that they're consciously and intentionally working on their pronunciation. So those ideas to help them process, to give them more insight, to have more memory hooks built into it. As a colleague says, telling me how to do it is not enough. Show me how, get me to do it myself. And also perhaps reflecting at the same time on your own pronunciation. In one EA journal, the volume 29, Adrian Underhill was asked a number of questions, and I thought his response about teachers' anxiety about their own accent not matching up with a particular phonemic chart and how that might reassure them. If it was possible to have an Australian English variant of the chart as American English does. And you can read his response where he's talking about people can and should teach their own accent. Now, of course, if you're teaching in a context where students are using American English materials, for example, working in different countries, or you know that there's a variant in what you're saying, what is on the CD. I remember coming across CDs with Monday, for example, versus Monday, and dealing with that with the students. But I thought his advice was quite good, and he talks about the fact that with his own accent, Southern British English, and a Scot, being able to use that same chart and work out what the pronunciation is, whether you're catching a bus or a bus, for example, but projecting your accent onto the chart. Let's see if we can get onto that. So I'll leave you to read that in your own time later, but I thought that was quite reassuring. At the end you can see he talks about making an Australian chart, but I find that quite difficult. Later you'll see the chart, well, not a chart actually, just a list of some of the symbols, and they're very complex. They reflect the wide variations in Australian English. The fact that learner dictionaries are not published with Australian English, I think just reflects the size of the market here, not necessarily the need. So later you will see the rest of those slides with British and American charts given there from various sources. Do check out some of the links there. They're quite useful. Here come the Australian ones for those who are serious about getting into transcribing pronunciation, but just remembering the Australian English vowel length, that's the biggest difference. You know, bad. It's really bad, mate. So a couple of links for inserting phonemic script. I find IPA Picker is useful, though they've just recently changed how you can use those, but you'll be able to work it out. There are also other charts around that have visuals to reinforce the sounds, but they're not organised in the same way because that's Underhill's organisation. And the other references that you'll see in a moment, some books and websites. There's even a group on Facebook, the Nasal Ingressive Voiceless Velar Trill community, that are quite amusing. Apparently that's a linguistic joke. There's a fake IPA symbol, looks like a pig snout. So they're a bunch of funsters, aren't they? Lots of websites around. I'm sure you'll be able to add to these. And also don't forget the very, very useful EA resources. Burry and Baker, Sweeting's webinar that he did last October, really interesting, and the pre-conference workshop that Underhill did in September. So problems you can work through with the answers, and we're getting to the end. The end is in sight. Looking at the time. So I just wanted to say thank you very much. It's been really interesting. I hope you have found it interesting and that you too find the chart a thing of beauty and a joy forever.
Oh, thanks, Claire. I'd like to ask if anyone in the audience has any questions, and if you do, could you please type them into your chat box now, please? So someone's asking if we get a copy of the slides. I'll post the recording of the webinar and the slides with Claire's annotations on our website. They'll be there from Monday morning. So you just need to...
I'm very happy for people to make use of that. That's why I put the notes in underneath the slides.
Great. So you'll get an email saying thank you for attending the webinar, and on that there'll be the link to the slides and to the recording. Okay, so there are some questions that have come through.
Mm-hmm.
So someone has just made a comment that they, before today's webinar, hadn't really thought that they could use this with their beginners because it would be too complex, but now they've changed their mind and think it could be really useful. What do you think about using the chart with beginners, Claire?
I think it is really useful if you're referring to it in class, not necessarily teaching them the whole thing in one go, but just as things arise and just gradually building up their awareness by connecting the problem they're dealing with or the new word they're trying to pronounce, making them aware of what's involved with pronunciation, using the chart just as that that anchor or that visual reminder. So perhaps having those words, getting them to make their own words to put into those spaces, and the words might be larger than the symbol. So I do think when people use it even with just the symbol, the students aren't necessarily processing and memorizing the symbol, but they're thinking about where it is in the chart and how that does reflect the pronunciation. So I'm really pleased that people think that it might be useful with students in some way, but I definitely think that it's so useful. I always have one around, and I do still need to look at it just to remind myself of some, particularly there's two diphthongs I always get mixed up.
Okay, another question. Someone said that they find it really difficult to hear the difference between the and th. And they've asked if there are many minimal pairs that exist.
Yeah, that one's a bit tricky. If I can go to, I did have the Korean minimal pairs in here, and with the minimal pairs, you know that activity, you've got a list of words on the left, a list of words on the right, and there's only one difference between the words. I used this example, if I can find it now, of some problems Koreans had, and that is one problem they tend to have, but it is very difficult to get the sounds they have a problem with. So, okay, I'm just going to quickly look at my notes because I can't move the slides at the moment. But the sounds, for example, teeth and teeth, thigh and thy, mouth and mouth as a verb. So using mouth, the noun, and mouth as a verb. And the classic with that, oh, it's going all over the place here. Okay, we're going backwards now. It was slide 39. I don't know if you can get to that. But with the minimal pairs, getting them to just listen, and they move if they hear one from, say, the left-hand column, and they don't move if they hear one from the right-hand column. Be careful with pronunciation activity books. There it is. They often say, you know, say put your left hand up for if it's in the left column, put your right hand up if it's in the right column. If you think about it, as a teacher, you're faced with these people with a sea of hands and you can't tell what's going on. So getting them to move if they hear, for example, teeth, and not move if they hear teeth, and you can quickly see if they're perceiving it, and then getting them to work in pairs where one of them tries saying it to their partner and their partner points to the word or the sound they think that they're hearing. There are some other variations there, getting them to write what they hear or number the words in order. So you have a list of words and numbering them in the order they hear them, or how many times they hear the th, for example, the unvoiced theta sound. So you might say, you know, this, that, these, those, teeth, teeth, thigh, thy, and they have to count how many times they heard the th. Now, obviously, you'd go a little bit more slowly, but helping them just differentiate words, you know, finding which one's the odd one out. Or that rather tricky one at the bottom, correct me if I'm wrong, where you're pointing to one particular word as you say it, and they have to tell you if you're saying it correctly or not.
Great. And someone else from the audience has just said that Ship or Sheep by Anne Baker has multiple examples of minimal pairs, which is true.
Yes.
And Trio 3, which I think was the sequel, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yes.
She was going to update it at one stage, but I don't know if that ever happened, but it does have good visuals. If you Google or use some of those references, you can find some others. And getting the students to make up their own minimal pairs list, it's possible, but it can be a bit tricky. You know, for example, in the set there for f and v, I doubt very much whether many students would know that, but it was the only one I could think of that came up to match fat. But still.
Okay, someone else has asked, how do we teach more advanced students pronunciation? So, for example, students whose pronunciation is already really good, like European speakers, do they need more work with pronunciation?
I think probably not with sounds, without seeing or hearing some examples, but they may want to work on the rhythm, the connected speech, getting the right intonation, and not only in producing, for example, the right intonation, but recognising it in others. For example, the difference between somebody saying, oh, thank you, versus thank you. You know, sometimes when you use your voice to reflect attitude and it's not the words. So, you know, can I help you to somebody who you think is doing something wrong or they're in the wrong place, what's conveyed there and how you say that. So not only their own production, but understanding others. It could also depend on what they're using English for, where they're working, for example, who they're working with, what they need to understand in other people's pronunciation. There's lots of interesting things to do, you know, say post-listening. You've got the tape script, the recording. There's lots of interesting things to do with connected speech and intonation, with sentence stress as well. That can also help them to understand keywords when they're listening to a lecture and when they're making notes.
Okay, great. Someone's made a comment which is probably useful for other people as well. They've said, this has been a really useful reminder, thank you. I'm going to get a copy to put up in my classroom for when prawn issues arise. And I think that
Fabulous.
just reiterates what you've said, Claire, which is it's great to have a copy of the chart up in your classroom to refer to.
And there's always, lots of other people out there who've like those EA resources I mentioned, things online who've got some other ideas, and you can exploit those and adapt them. Sometimes you do have to compromise a little bit. For example, with consonant clusters, is it a real problem, for example, because they're going from the voiced to the unvoiced to the voiced? That seems to be a reason why that might be a bit tricky, getting that n to sound together. But if they say introduce and voice them all, it's not a really big issue, that you can actually still be quite unambiguous there. But some other strategies, for example, with lunch, with Thai speakers not getting that n-ch cluster, there's lots of strategies where you can focus on the sounds separately, the n-ch, and speeding them up. Looking for clusters across separate words. So, for example, with lunch, you see the same cluster occurring across two separate words, like 10 chips or ring Clare. But that's an example of where connected speech can help to find examples of vowel sounds following from lunch of or think of, where they can link that k sound onto the sound that's following. So that might help them get around the problem. Just thinking about, is it really affecting communication? And otherwise, maybe not a big problem.
Okay, another question. How much time would you spend on prawn in a general English course?
Wow, interesting question.
Yeah.
I suppose it depends on how long the lesson is, how long the course is, how long the students are there. But usually, I think it comes into lessons often, when new words are coming up, or dealing with problems they've had with the listening. They've heard one thing, but actually something else was said, unpacking that. So I find it very hard to give an answer there. It depends on the students, their time, the aim of the course, and their needs. But I do think it's worth just trying to recognise where there might be opportunities in your lessons for them. And again, perhaps your students can give you feedback on what they want.
Okay. Someone else has asked if you can recommend ways to help fossilise speakers, for example, advanced speakers with a strong native accent, with their pronunciation.
That's really interesting. I think techniques like shadowing, where you play a short excerpt of something. Say they really like a particular TV series, they've got that on DVD or they've got that on YouTube. They just listen, playing a short excerpt, and then pause and try and think about what they heard, let it resonate in their head, then try and say it. That can really help. That helps them pick up more about the rhythm, the way things are said. And also it's dealing with something that they've already understood in the context and on what's happening with language, because they're interested in that particular TV show or movie. You could even use parts of ads, but usually you'll find more ranges of natural pronunciation with intonation, etc., occurring in a movie or a TV show. So playing a short clip, pausing, thinking about what they've heard, letting it resonate or echo, saying it under their breath, and then trying to say it themselves. I've found that really useful when I've been trying to speak more naturally in some other languages.
Okay.
It's something they can do at home as well, not on the bus. People look at you a bit weirdly.
All right. Another question, is it useful to separate the syllables out in longer words and get students to practice them separately when working on consonant clusters?
I think that can help if you break it down with consonant clusters. So, for example, what's another one? Say, for example, with library, if they've got a problem with that br cluster, if they can use it at the beginning of a word like brown or brilliant, for example, then okay, that's fine. But perhaps getting them to take a little breath after the b sound before they go on to the sound. So, for example, saying library, perhaps getting them to get over that, or a little breath just after the little breath there, so then they're treating the br as an initial cluster if they can already do that. But maybe doing the br, bringing those separate sounds from far apart to closer together. But perhaps if it's insurmountable, really just putting a little schwa after the b and then sliding into the . So breaking up the longer words in general, I think it can help them to see and think about how those different elements are being pronounced, but then of course bring it back together to the natural way that they would be hearing it as well as pronouncing it out in the real world, so that it's real and it's not always the slowed down version of pronunciation.
Yeah. Okay. And the last question, someone's just come back to the L and R sound. I know you talked about it a little bit, and they've said that those sounds are their students' biggest issue. Do you have any other tips for those sounds?
If it's a big issue, is it a big issue with communication, or is it a big issue because they have either been told or they think that they've got a big problem with it? In context, when people are speaking, if they're talking about turning light, people are not going to pick up on whether they said light there, as I did, because in context, turn light at the next set of lights. Okay, it's not necessarily going to be a huge problem, but doing things like, la 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 la, making it a bit fun, and just really helping them to practice moving their tongue. It's a bit like preparing to run a race. You work on little elements of how you crouch down and then how you set off. You don't just run the whole race. So perhaps doing a little bit of work regularly on that, and reassuring them if it is a problem or not. Maybe it's perceived as being different, what they're saying, what others might say, but is it a real problem? In Japanese, those two are allophones. They're regarded as the same, and so they can move quite easily between what we see as two different sounds, the ul, without really noticing. But again, a little bit and often, lots of encouragement, making it varied, making it fun, giving them feedback and encouragement,
Okay, great. And the person who asked that question said that yes, it is with communication, just answering your question as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I'd love to hear some examples where that's really blocked the communication.
I think she's saying some students can't hear the difference either.
Okay. But then in hearing the difference, if they're thinking about the meaning, if they've got the meaning of the utterance, then perhaps whether or not they've perceived that difference isn't a big problem. That's really an interesting question.
Some food for thought, perhaps.
It's always good to have something to chew on.
Thanks to Barbara, who's been asking those questions. All right, well, we'll have to finish there. But Claire, thank you so much for presenting today's webinar. I think you've shared your love of the chart with us, and it's quite contagious, and pass on that love, and it becomes something very fun the way that you talk about it. And so thank you very much for sharing that with us, and to everyone else for coming, thank you as well. And Claire, there are lots of thank yous coming through in the chat box for you from the audience too.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Okay, so we'll finish the webinar now. Thanks everyone.
All right, thanks Sophie for your part.
Thanks.